Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar. My name is George Glass and I am the Head of Threat Intelligence at Redscan, a division of Kroll Cyber Risk. Today's session will be focused on digital risk protection, often referred to as darknet monitoring. We will be looking at how digital risk protection can be merged with cyber threat intelligence services to not only track threats, but take action against threats happening outside of your network. To do this, we have two seasoned experts joining us today, but first, a bit of housekeeping. Before we get started, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's session will be recorded and you'll receive a recording of the slides within the next few days after the session. We're using GoToWebinar for this presentation and you'll find their client floating somewhere on your monitor. Through that client, you'll be able to submit questions at any time and our presenters will address questions at the end. Today, I'm excited to be able to introduce our presenters, Keith Wojcicki and Laurie Iacono. Keith is a Managing Director and Global Head of Threat Intelligence at Kroll and is based in Washington, D.C. office. Keith joined Kroll from the US Secret Service, where he served with distinction for 15 years. Keith founded and leads Kroll's Cyber Threat Intelligence Program. Laurie is a Senior Vice President in Kroll Cyber Risk here at Kroll. She manages the operations of the Global Cyber Intelligence Analyst team and is a former lead at the National Cyber Forensics Training Alliance. With that, I turn over to Keith to kick us off.
Thank you, George. Really appreciate it, and really appreciate everyone being on the call today. We're going to go through some really interesting things, and please, we all ask. I know this is a webinar where we're doing most of the talk or all the talking, but we do encourage questions along the way so we can address them. I think that's the best way to get answers to some of the things that are going on, especially when we're talking about digital risk protection. In overall, what is digital risk protection? I guess the best way to describe it is it's a security risk that across web domains, social media, deep and dark web, in order to protect yourselves, in order to mitigate any type of risks. On social media, you're looking at different types of media presence from account takeovers, social media phishing scams, and any type of malicious content. For surface web and looking at domains, what fraudulent domains pose a risk to you? What fraudulent domains propose a risk to your brand and customers? So we want to make sure we're looking at that as well. We're going to discuss that. And then the dark web, really identifying any potential risk that a threat actor is out there discussing, selling, or exploiting information on some of these closed source sites. So kind of getting into the next slide here, we're looking at traditional security and how you develop a security posture and where kind of this all falls into place. Nowadays, to be your security, having security maturity increase and saying that you have a really advanced, mature environment, you want to make sure you have some of these check boxes. When those that have the network defense, looking at basic cyber hygiene, it's more of an ad hoc and reactive measure, and we're seeing a lot of that right now with different companies that are just getting into cybersecurity, trying to mature the process. The second one, endpoint monitoring, really kind of gets into more of an intermediate cyber hygiene where the focus is on compliance and regulations, and it's not necessarily standardized, but you're improving it. And then looking at phishing detection, that's just an example of something that people utilize for advanced cyber hygiene, looking and focusing on awareness and implementation of different changes. Looking at practices, phishing, spam protection, DNS filtering, and really to be able to back up and restore data. And then having that endpoint monitoring and looking at real-time monitoring as well. So it's not just there, people are actually looking at it and mitigating any results that come from or alerts that come from it. Then cloud security and deep and dark web and surface monitoring, that's more of a long-term and sustainable maturity process. It's really kind of at the top, looking at different pen tests, looking for existing vulnerabilities and making sure you're testing those vulnerabilities, and then looking at specific requirements and focus on automation of scanning. Now NIST has a really good projection method of what you need to do in order to maintain this high level of maturity. And this here just kind of shows you that what we're talking about today is a mature environment, which everyone here on the call is. So it's really, how is this going to benefit me? So getting into the common types of digital risk exposure, we have a whole list of here, just for example, what we're seeing. exposed credentials. I mean, looking at the pipeline, that was one of the ones that they had exposed credentials like that. That's very prominent now. We're seeing all these different exposed credentials, and Lori's going to get into talking specifics on that. Different types of leaks, different types of information that's being sold and talked about on the deep and dark web. And not only that, but they have that gray area, the middle area where it could be on Twitter. I mean, Twitter's social media, but it could be on Twitter, it could be on Discord, 4chan, any of these different platforms that it's not only dark web. Like we need to kind of get away from just the dark web that's exposed all over the place. But these are some examples of things that are definitely out there. Now, the next slide, we get into how Kroll, in a sense, looks at exposures and assessments and rates them. Depending on different types of events that take place, we're looking from no risk to all the way to high risk. Now, an example of a low risk is exposed credentials from a third party. May not be yours, but you're signing up for Mira, you're signing up for LinkedIn, and they have a data breach and it's exposed. And so that's how we look at this low risk. It's not necessarily towards the company itself, but there is some type of exposure out there. Looking at no or minimal dark web exposure, and then so on and so forth. You can kind of see the different bullet points when it comes to low risk. Now, high risk is a different story because we want to really kind of get involved with, okay, what is being exposed out there? What do I need to worry about? Administrative credentials. We're seeing an uptick in that where they have admin credentials into different platforms, whether it be your VPN, whether it be inside your Windows environment, your servers, looking at the domain controllers and seeing that these credentials could potentially be exposed. Do you have MFA involved? Is two-factor something that is incorporated throughout? So when you see this type of exposure, it's something that needs to be alerted immediately and taken care of. Looking at identify different vulnerabilities. Now, 2021, and I think Lori's going to briefly go on this, has been a complete mayhem when it comes to different vulnerabilities been exposed. So we'll talk about that. And then looking at sensitive data exposed by a threat actor, whether it's on these threat actor websites or blogs, they post victims of whatever type of attack or exploiting them for whatever reason. That's something that's very prominent and want to make sure that that's a high risk alert. And then looking at different type of exposure on open and closed sources that is proprietary, could be sensitive information. That's how we rate, and we get it's more of a not a numerical, but shows how someone will rate with this exposure. Now, in doing a lot of these investigations, like George said, I run the threat intel, but I also work regularly with the IR team and looking at different types of events that take place. And when we're doing something like that, we're seeing all types of attacks, all different vectors. Now, this slide, as you see it, can be quite, I don't want to say confusing, but there's a lot to it. And, this is just one attack. This is just one group attacking an infrastructure. This is an example of a real attack and how we get to where we are. Like, how do you get to this and protect everything? In starting this, what we want to understand is how these attackers approach their victims. There's more of two-phased approach. They're number one, taking a top left. They're looking at port scanning to identify any open ports. That's kind of their first thing they're doing. Then in parallel, the attacker sends a phishing email. If you look to the right, looking at phishing emails to try to get to key personnel to get some kind of credentials. And then as they're doing this, they're also doing the exact same thing that we would be doing on a proactive sense. They're looking at dark web monitoring. They're looking at see what is exposed out there. How's your company? Is there something that they can exploit to get on your systems? Once that phase is completed, then they're going to find some way to get in some way to attack the network. They either can gain a foothold into different ways, putting a dropper in an email file, a mail doc, or they could have some type of put Cobalt Strike or Mimikatz or some type of a credential stealer to gain the access and then gain additional access within your environment. Then, as you're seeing, they're in your environment. At that point, they're deploying ransomware, or they're extorting information and pulling this information, exfilling it to a different command and control server, and they're taking that and they're going to post it or email you, however their method is to actually let everyone know, hey, I have your data, and now what? So in seeing this and looking at this, you want to think, okay, how prepared am I? Am I prepared to defend against port scanning? Do I have some type of maturity level that I'm doing these phishing attacks that my company's not going to fall to for a phishing attack? It happens. They're really good. They're very sophisticated. They're not the old school phishing that's you identified. I mean, they're very good at phishing emails. And then lastly, are you doing something to mitigate their dark web monitoring as well? They have access to all of this just because they're in there. They know where to go. They know where to look. So, it's very important to understand, your maturity level and what you do to protect yourself in order to maintain a foothold on, the upper levels these guys can attack you. With that, I'm going to turn over to Lori. Lori's going to go into a little bit more in depth with some of the stuff we talked about.
Thanks, Keith and George, for that introduction. So Keith kind of, gave a high level of what digital risk protection is. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we operationalize these investigations as an analyst team. So this slide here is looking at digital exposure and the threat actor. So as Keith had mentioned in the last slide, we know that some attacks will begin with something like port scanning. So they're looking for vulnerabilities. And a lot of times when threat actors start out, they're looking for these kind of open source tools. Maybe they're using even something like Shodan to find those vulnerabilities. We also know here, these are some examples of other tools, that threat actors are kind of using, all kinds of OSINT collection to find information about their targets. So what we do as a team is we try to kind of think like the threat actor, and if we were going to, target your organization or target you as an individual, where, what data would that threat actor be able to find? So some of the places we're looking are, obviously social media, white pages. So what kind of information is out there on public records, as well as, Tor, the dark web. That's something obviously that we're covering. Zoom info down there. So that's an interesting one. We've actually seen a lot of threat actors recently. They're using that to basically identify the revenue and size of a company, and this is helping them in their ransomware targeting. So, that's just another thing that they're using. Also here, GitHub and Pastebin. So we see sometimes that, maybe a former employee will intentionally leave something out there that would be related to, proprietary or source code on GitHub or Pastebin. We've also seen cases where maybe someone had intentionally left behind AWS key or an API key that a threat actor can then hold. So these are the kind of things that we're trying to look at when we do our investigations. And we kind of do two different investigations for clients related to this. One is what we would call kind of like a exposure assessment. So this might be a one-time, maybe like a 1-year look back that we would do on an organization or an individual to kind of try to create their risk profile. So this is an example here of one of these cases. We were specifically looking at a high net worth individual. And we do know that those individuals are targeted a lot. You think of CEOs or C-level employees, or people with a lot of ownership. So when we did this one for this individual, what we found through our exposure review was that, although the individual's social media accounts were actually private, it was very easy to find his spouse. His spouse actually had public accounts for most of her social media, and the information that was out there were things like, their children's names. There were actually pictures of their children with the company logo of where the CEO works, so making that connection between that family and the organization. There were, things about where they were traveling, so kind of easy to like geolocate them based on that. We were also able to find from this investigation, like very quickly, we were able to find the name of his assistant. So you could know kind of who to target from an executive assistant perspective. We also found a lot of public records with both his and his spouse's current cell phone numbers being listed, as well as some exposed credentials. So these are these ones that Keith mentioned. They might have, used their either personal or employee emails to sign up for a third-party service. And when that third-party service gets breached in some way, those passwords are then exposed. So based on that, kind of amount of data that we were seeing, we rated that individual as having significant exposure. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that we kind of, assess them as being a risk for certain types of attacks. Credential stuffing would be one. This would be if they were reusing that password on other attacks. Actors might try to, basically do some account checking to test those passwords to get into accounts specifically that would have financial data. Because of all this like specific information, maybe even like children's schools and things like that, it's very likely that someone could craft a very convincing targeted spear phishing campaign that would target the CEO. And because of the availability of his assistant's name, there is, the risk for business email compromise, because many times these actors will prey on the assistants as a route to try to get some kind of fraudulent wire fraud transferred. We also flag them for SIM swapping. SIM swapping is something that we see targeting these kind of higher net worth individuals, because it's usually they're trying to very quickly make a large financial transaction. So having those current cell phone numbers exposed on a quick Google search isn't usually a good idea. We also said, specifically since the pandemic, we've seen a lot of unemployment fraud, taking individuals' information like this. So that's something else that they would be at risk for. So when we were able to give this information to our client, we were also able to kind of help advise them on locking down some of their social media accounts, removing some of that content, as well as getting some of their cell phone numbers taken off of these public record sites. Now, on the next example here, this is looking more at an organization. They had exposure, but we kind of rated it as moderate in this case, because a lot of the exposure that we saw was what we would think as expected exposure for a corporation. They're going to have corporate social media accounts. They're going to be in the news with press releases. We did not find any dark web chatter related to this organization, but we did find that nearly 30% of their employees were included in or had exposed credentials. And many of these exposed credentials, unfortunately, were from pretty recent data security incidents, which means there's a higher likelihood that those plain text passwords could actually be valid, even potentially for their corporate logon. So we assessed that company to be at risk for things like phishing campaigns. The employees were definitely at risk for credential stuffing attacks, and then the corporations were at risk potentially for unauthorized access. So this was interesting. In this case, our client was really thankful for this information, because what they found when they got the exposed credential list was that almost all of these credentials were from a certain global region. So they realized that maybe their training had some deficiencies with that region, and then they were able to target some user education and prevention campaigns to hopefully prevent that in the future. And they were able to do some password resets to kind of mitigate that in the immediate term. So we've talked a lot about credentials. In the next section, I'm going to talk about how we see some of the threat actors using those credentials and the different ways that we see credentials posted on the dark web. And this stat, unfortunately, it's a little scary. It's talking about there's estimated to be about 15 billion stolen logins from 100,000 different breaches that are available on the deep and dark web. So this first one here, this is an example of something we found on an underground criminal forum. This is a data leak related to Fortinet VPN sessions. So there was a CVE to Fortinet devices. It's actually from 2018, but unfortunately some people have not patched that. And this CV basically allows threat actors, if they exploit it, they can go in and they can basically extract logs of the web sessions. So they're basically getting the usernames and passwords of everyone that is logging into that VPN while the actor is on the system. And then what they will do is they will package them up. In this case, they put a huge data set together and they dumped it for free on this RAID forums. We were later able to see from our ransomware incident response investigations, we were able to trace back a lot of our ransomware cases, actually, that the user accounts had been leaked in this specific data set. Now, obviously, cyber criminals, they don't like to just give everything out for free. So we're also seeing where they're trying to monetize this type of information. So this slide here represents, this is an auction from the Russian language forum exploit. And these actors are what we call initial access brokers. And basically they're data mining for these kind of dark web credentials. when they're finding valid matches, particularly if they're able to identify that that match is related to maybe someone with a domain admin account, they will then offer them on the forums for sale for network access. And this is another one where we've oftentimes been able to trace back what we call patient zero in our ransomware investigations to one of these postings on exploit, because we know, a lot of the ransomware affiliates, they congregate on these particular sites, and the ransom operators will oftentimes buy these as an easier way to, and guaranteed way to get into a system, right? So another thing that we're seeing a lot of on the dark web when it comes to credentials are these credential shops. So Amigos is just one example. It's a newer market. Genesis, Russian market, Too Easy Shop, those are just a few of the names of these markets. But essentially, what these markets are offering is access into an infected computer. And when the threat actor buys the listing for this computer, they're basically getting everything that's associated with that user's browser extension. So they're getting all the saved logins and passwords. They're getting the device fingerprint. They're getting, it looks like they're coming from that device IP. They're getting, user agent string. So all those technical indicators that would make it look like it was coming from that machine. And that allows the threat actor to then pivot off of that to access these accounts. And they're doing this because because now that it looks like they're coming from that user's machine, it's less likely that they'll be detected by fraud tools that might otherwise be immediately detecting and eliminating this kind of behavior. So we do see a lot of matches on these sites. One of typically we think of these kind of listings being used for some kind of fraud purposes. They're trying to get into a bank account or a retailer with a saved credit card. But we have also seen organizational subdomains on these lists. So, maybe a domain for an organization with something like auth login or an SSO designation. And in these cases, it's possible that it could be, an organization's employees had actually either their personal computer or their corporate machine had been infected. And now those corporate credentials are available for sale on the dark web. So this is something that we kind of help our clients monitor for with kind of longer term dark web monitoring engagements that we do. Now, I've talked a little bit about ransomware and the way that they're using the credentials. Another thing that we're seeing right now in the ransomware ecosphere is this tactic of what's called double extortion. So essentially, if a company has been encrypted and they're the victim of ransomware, as if the encryption isn't bad enough, the actors are also exfiltrating data, and then they're dumping that data on, we call them kind of actor-controlled sites, where they're basically allowing others in the community to download that data. So you can see here the statistics that 86% of our ransomware cases are associated with these kind of double extortion tactics. And we've really been watching this throughout the past year of the growth of these sites. So these are new extortion sites or new leak sites that were published. So you can see here in Q1 of this year, 3 of them were published, and in Q3, 24 of these sites were actually added. And this is all in addition to all the other sites that were already out there from 2020. But it's just interesting to see the kind of explosion of this tactic. And it also means that there's a lot of data out there now that these threat actors have to mine through before they actually look at a target. So even if maybe like your organization wasn't directly hit with a ransomware attack, if any of your suppliers or third parties that you work with there's a potential that information about your employees or your business could be out there in one of these data leaks. So that's also something that we monitor for. Now, this next case study, so this is one where this is a gang called Cuba Ransomware, and they have a shaming site that was published in January of this year. In this instance, we had a client who had an incident response event by this group, and after that, they did long-term monitoring with us. So we were able to actually identify when the post for them went live on this Cuba ransomware site. And then the actor was basically, you know, through our investigation forensically, we did not identify that the actors had gotten access to PII, but they were still pressuring the victims, saying that they had PII, especially when they published this site. They were saying, again, we have PII, we're going to publish it. Because we were able to find the post and get the data, we were able to see that they actually did not have PII. The only thing they posted were things that were actually publicly available. So in this case, I was able to help the client determine the scope of what had went out. Unfortunately, sometimes we see this on the flip side, where, you know, actually what is posted is PII. So that's something that we're able to help our clients with, to kind of just determine the scope of an incident. This is something particularly we do with due diligence investigations for our clients. So if a company is thinking about maybe doing business with a third party, or acquiring another company, this is something they can come to us for. We can do kind of a digital risk assessment of that other company and see if information like that is out there. We have found a couple times where maybe the third-party company wasn't as honest about the exposure, and when we were able to do our research, we found that there was a lot more PII out there than had been anticipated, and this helped our client kind of, you know, determine the scope and also the potential cost of doing business with this company. So those were some examples from the ransomware shaming site. The next case study, this is more of a situational case study. So a lot of times for our clients, they will come to us, particularly in times of political or social unrest, when there may be like physical rioting or demonstrations that might be happening that they think will affect their either one of their office locations or one of the individuals working for them. They will come to us to do some monitoring. Thanks to some of the tools that we have and the undercover access that we have, you know, we are sometimes able to get into these channels where the company might not have visibility to the chatter that is happening, but we, through our undercover analysts, can actually get in there and see what is going on in these chat groups and let our clients know. So this was the case where an executive who came to us, this was leading up to the 2020 US elections, and the executive had basically been doxxed for contributing to a certain campaign, and all of their information was out there. When the client came to us, there was a lot of, you know, third-hand information that they were getting about specifically what the threat was against them. They were concerned about, you know, possibly a physical threat that was being waged against them or their offices. We were able to get into this channel where the activity was occurring, and we were able to see, fortunately, in this case, there was not a specific threat against that executive or their organization. There was the doxing in relation to a campaign donation, but that was all the information that was out there. We were also able to see, because we monitored that for about a month, you know, on behalf of the client, we were also able to see that, you know, eventually the activity in that chatter had kind of translated away from our client, and they had kind of found a new target that they were going towards. So we were able to, you know, provide weekly updates to our client about the status of this activity to kind of give them some peace of mind about during this period. So those are the case studies that I have as far as the, you know, digital risk protection investigations that our team does. So I will hand it over to George now for closing summary.
Thank you, Laurie and Keith. Some really great content in there. I'm going to do my best to try and summarize that. Firstly, digital risk protection, we found out is best suited for organizations with a more mature security posture. Those organizations that are looking to go to the next step after network monitoring, after endpoint detect and respond, the last step in completing that cybersecurity life cycle. Credentials found on the dark web are commonly identified as patient zero in incident response investigations. I think this is a really important point. a number of threat actors will try and go for the easiest route, obviously. And if they can find some credentials to log straight into an application, absolutely they're going to do that. So a very, very important part of keeping a awareness of what's going on in the outside world. Threat actor tactics are constantly evolving, and in the last few years have increased usage of credential shops, double extortion, and shaming websites. Again, we're seeing this more and more as more threat actor groups band together and create a sort of a secondary market for a lot of their compromises. Lower skilled actors simply selling on the access to organizations, to ransomware groups. Again, a very, very important development in the threat landscape there. Merging DRP with threat intelligence not only allows you to track threats, but actually take action before the threat has reached your organization. And as Keith and Laurie said earlier, this year has been particularly big for extortion sites, monitoring those, understanding what's going on those threat actor controlled sites, but also for vulnerabilities as well. Especially in the last few months, we've had some very high impact vulnerabilities be announced and released, and keeping on top of that and understanding the exposure of your network to those vulnerabilities is incredibly important, because threat actors will certainly want to be finding out. The monitoring can be leveraged in ransomware investigations, brand and fraud protection, high visibility staff protection, reputational management, and data loss management. All of these things, as we mentioned before, are sort of the more mature security practice. But if you're looking to get into that space, if you have requirements to be monitoring these things, certainly monitoring the deep and dark web and using tools to gather OSINT data is extremely important in these cases. So I think we have some time to put some questions to Keith and Rory here. Let me just check what we've got. So we've got a couple of questions come through. Steve asks, from a legal perspective, is it better sometimes not to know what's on the dark web?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but I can definitely address that. You know, and kind of going back to one of our original slides we talked, Lori and I actually both touched on it. Is it better not to know? I would say no, but again, I guess it depends on your approach, right? If it's something that you want to identify what these attackers are seeing and how they're going to gain access into your network, I mean, it's just a portion. They're doing reconnaissance. They're looking at this. This is a tool for use to just kind of put your head in the sand and not acknowledge it. I think is something that you may want to reconsider. Just trying to identify best, what makes my cyber maturity the most proper, and how do we go about looking at certain things to make sure that we're protected the way we need to be protected. Lori, I'll let you kind of answer that as well, if you have any comments.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have my lawyer hat on. I don't even know that I have that hat. I have more of the security risk hat. But I would say, I mean, I think, we mostly talk about these around, looking for vulnerabilities so that people can take, any mitigation steps to kind of avoid some of these risks, particularly with around the credentials. We see them as patient zero. We would like to see them before they become patient zero, and then we can, let the client know that, that it's out there and they can take the risk. But obviously that's something that, every corporation or every organization has some kind of a, risk management with their own counsel or outside counsel. So that's something that they kind of have to decide as far as how much they want to know. But we do believe it is, valuable information that can help avoid some of these cases.
Great, thank you very much. I've got another question here. Victoria has asked, is digital risk protection included in my network monitoring service that Kroll provides?
Laura, I'll let you field that if you want to talk about that briefly.
Yeah, so it is not included as a standard in the network monitoring that Kroll provides. But obviously, for anyone that has network monitoring, we do offer discounts for those clients. So if that's something that people are interested in, based on different factors, we can work with everyone on pricings for those kind of packages.
Fantastic. I think that's all of the questions that we've had so far. So a couple of closing remarks from me. As we've run out of time. A big thank you to Keith and Laurie, and of course everyone that's taken the time to tune in. We hope you found today's session very informative. If you'd like any assistance on digital risk practice, then please feel free to reach out to a member of the team at Kroll. We'd be happy to have a discussion with you. After the session, we'll send all attendees the slides and the recording of this webinar, so you can revisit any parts of the session that you wish to. When you leave the webinar, you'll be directed to a short survey. If you could spare a few moments, we'd be really grateful if you could tell us what you thought, as this helps prepare for future webinars. Once again, thanks a lot for joining us today. Enjoying the rest of your day, and we hope to see you again at one of our future webinars. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate it.